Doctor, absolute pleasure to speak to you. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
That's going to be a fascinating conversation for me because I've been doing about 6 interviews, 5 to 7 interviews a day, hours a day, talking about the Iran war, and a lot of that was dependent on Trump's decision making and why he's made certain decisions. The decision, I'm not bothered by his posts. I'm confused. I laugh, but I'm also confused by his posts about the Pope. I'm not bothered by his posts about Iran because for me, I saw it as a madman theory in action, trying to force Iran to concede. You're the expert, so you're going to correct me, and I'm just going to be listening. But I'm really confused about obviously the Pope post, but I'm really confused at why he got into this war. And I've been talking to a lot of people on in these interviews and behind the scenes to try to really understand it because I'm fascinated by it. So, Doctor, take me through the process on why you're concerned about it, and should we be concerned, and why. I'm all ears.
Well, first of all, you're asking the absolute right question because, of course, the issue of the moment is the Iran war. So how his mental processes might be playing into the decisions he's making that really affect life and death on the world stage is really what's paramount. Here's what we know from the reporting. Part of what we know is he wasn't advised to go to war by the national security establishment. He wasn't advised by the military. He wasn't advised by the intelligence community. Even within his own tight circle of people, the only one who was really urging it was Pete Hegseth, not the vice president. Rubio typically was mealy-mouthed, But the thing is that he just made this decision impulsively. And actually, the timing of it was quite bizarre because what we know is that there were negotiations going on, and the Iranians had already made concessions to Trump that they had never made to Barack Obama. He was actually winning the negotiations. Art of the deal, he could have been crowed that he was the master of the art of the deal because Iran had already agreed, according to a British security officer, Jonathan Powell, who was part of the negotiations, right? That Iran had agreed to stop enriching uranium for 5 years. They had agreed to degrade the uranium that they already had and not to stockpile anymore. So we had won. And so you talk about the madman theory. I think that Iran actually made those concessions because they do believe that he is a madman, and they do believe that he would literally attack them in a violent and savage way. But he had won. See, the madman theory only works if you're not actually mad. The madman theory, that Nixon and Kissinger were the ones who brought this into the vocabulary. Their idea was if you're actually rational, but the other side thinks you're crazy and you'll do anything, that gives you leverage in the negotiations. It doesn't help if you're actually mad, because it was mad to attack when he was winning the negotiations, when no one in his administration or the larger government was advising it. And Maggie Haberman said, basically, he made this decision on a gut instinct, full stop. So look, this is what's really frightening, okay, is that, look, I have said for a long time that I think Donald Trump has a malignant narcissistic personality disorder. That makes him paranoid and grandiose. It makes him a bully, makes him a liar, makes him aggressive. Okay. But now we do have this other factor, which is some cognitive decline, where he is clearly becoming more impulsive, more disinhibited, losing some real judgment. For example, why would you attack the Pope? There's no advantage to it, right? That's where you're saying, hey, I'm scratching my head. Maybe this guy's really playing three-dimensional chess and, he's faking Iran out with all of these madman moves. And then you look at something like this and go, that's just nuts. That's just nuts. It's not helping him. It's a crazy thing to do. To post a picture of yourself as Jesus, I mean, it's almost textbook psychiatric delusions of grandeur. So he is actually showing us his mental illness in these really florid ways. And he's pushing us towards more and more military conflict. He's been saying, the military can't wait till their next conquest. I'll take Cuba next. See, I think he's getting an addictive rush and some actually pleasure. Sadism is a component of malignant narcissism. And he has been accused by multiple women of rape. And he is suspected of child rape. And so that is an act of sadism. Okay. He is a sadist, in my opinion. And so he gets a sadistic pleasure out of blowing things up. And that's why he seems so happy about it. And he said to Jonathan Karl, hey, how you enjoying the show? When they were taking pictures of them blowing up things in Iran, and they were gamifying them on videos, by splicing them with video games. Like, it's all one big joke. It's all one big game. The problem is that as he's being threatened at home, okay, it's not just a matter of distracting from the Epstein investigation. Everything in Donald Trump is about his own mental state and the moment, what makes him feel better in the moment. And so he's experiencing something that we call a narcissistic collapse, which is his polls are tanking, the economy is tanking. Now, 55% of the American people don't think he's mentally competent to be president. Epstein's not going away. Well, what happens when you have a cornered, wounded animal? That's when they're most dangerous. Because even if the Democrats win both houses of Congress, he's still the commander in chief. And he's still using military conflict as a way of soothing and exciting himself, making himself feel better in the moment. And I don't think that the planet is going to survive 3 more years of that. I think we really may be hurtling towards doomsday.
Wow. Okay. A lot of points. I'm going to start with the last one about military conflict. Let's actually talk about the Pope one. Look, I was in Armenia a few weeks ago, and they were telling me about the president there, the current president. They told me about some of the things he's doing. He actually attacked, funny enough, I just remembered it while you're speaking, he attacked the religious figures in Armenia as well. And I would ask them, like, why would he do it? It just sounds very rude. They're like, Mario, this is his way. He's actually very popular, but his way is just, he speaks very openly, he speaks his mind, and sometimes he attacks people, even though it might not make strategic sense. He's not always thinking strategically. He lashes out emotionally. Can't that same description be made to Trump? And that is one of the things that people like about Trump is he's far from perfect, but one of them is he's not as political as many other politicians. He says things that other politicians don't say. And in his first terms, he would say these things in debates and stuff and criticize journalists and make fun of them and make all these statements that everyone wasn't shocked back then. But then what the voters saw, someone who's more authentic, who's more real, who speaks their mind, who has no filter. So when someone makes comments like this that don't make strategic sense, and I agree, it didn't make sense to me, why would you? The one about Iran bombing them to the Stone Age, which is a genocidal statement, everyone was up in arms. I'm like, guys, I think he's seeking an off-ramp. With the Pope one, it doesn't make sense. But isn't there also a possibility that he's just lashing out emotionally? He just doesn't have a filter?
I've always said that Trump's personality disorder is in some ways the best camouflage for his dementia, because you can say about all of these horrible behaviors, well, hasn't he always been like this? Well, the truth is that when someone has a personality disorder and then they get some form of dementia, what always happens is that their personality disorder becomes 10 times worse. So whatever was problematic before now becomes completely out of control. And unfortunately, with the experts, and I wouldn't class myself as one of the top experts. I've spoken to a number of top dementia experts who this is what they do for their whole careers. It seems to be focusing on this type of dementia called frontotemporal dementia, which is not Alzheimer's, which is not what his father had. But with frontotemporal dementia, the biggest giveaway, it's their frontal lobes that are starting to deteriorate. And the frontal lobes are where we have our judgment and our capacity to sort of game out what's going to happen, and our capacity to inhibit our impulses, right? Filter. So sometimes we do have to filter. One of the symptoms of frontotemporal dementia, I love this very quaint language. It's the loss of decorum. But in other words, it sounds so quaint, right? So 19th century. But in other words, when he started calling people piggy and started cursing and saying fuck and, stuff that presidents never did and that he never did, it's him. Yeah, it's him attacking everybody and him being aggressive and him not having a filter, but in a more confused and gross, chaotic, impulsive, rash, poorly thought out way. So I would argue that personality that we're describing was a very disordered personality to begin with if you're constantly attacking everybody all the time. And he was. I even edited a book about his tweets like 10 years ago, and I couldn't believe it. I had to read thousands of his tweets. Like, how can this guy be up all night just talking about how much he hates everybody? Like, where do you even get that kind of destructive, negative energy night after night? But now he's becoming more confused and more disoriented, and it's more chaotic. And the point is that if he were your father, right, and you saw the symptoms that we're seeing with him, you would take away the car keys and you would rush him to a neurologist. These are not normal behaviors, even for him.
Unless I have discussions with him, so everyone I speak to that knows Trump, that has worked with Trump, and these are usually things they say behind the scenes, not much on camera, and people that have known him for many years, they do say there's two personas: the Trump that's public facing, and that one could argue is strategy, and it has worked. He's been elected twice. He has a very loyal following. And the other one is the Trump behind the scenes, who's one that listens. I remember a conversation I had a few days ago with someone very close to Trump who works with him. And they were also surprised about the war, and we're discussing what could have led him to it. But they do describe a Trump that did listen to both sides. And unfortunately for the war, someone had his ear more than the others, who was who's very different as a persona than the one we see behind the tweets. And I think even Jake Paul interviewed him recently, Jake Paul, who's an influencer online, and he said something similar after. He's like, oh, you're very different, even very different behind the scenes. And I think another few influencers that have interviewed him, when Trump started doing the rounds with influencers, not just journalists, they did describe Trump as very different in person than the one we see behind the phone with those tweets. So that's why, and I've got a lot more questions for you. That's why a counter argument to that, this is all part of his strategy, one would hope.
Well, I think that's it. It's wishful thinking. I think we're hoping because the alternative is too frightening to consider. But, the other article I wanted to point out is, the Wall Street Journal said they kept him out of the Situation Room when they were planning the raid to rescue that airman. And the quote was, "We thought his impatience wouldn't be helpful." So he is not in some way measuring, in some statesman-like way, hearing from both sides and really digesting it. He seems to be, first of all, he doesn't think anyone knows anything other than him, right? He's always thought, I'm my own best advisor because I have such a great head, a great intellect. I know more about war than the generals. So he never really is someone who sought consultation. He's always someone who thinks that whatever he thinks, even if it's something crazy, like you should inject bleach or put a light in the body to get rid of COVID, if the nature of his narcissism is, if it occurs to him, it must be true and it must be brilliant, even if it's crazy.
I want to ask you a question before we go back to the various points. You mentioned frontotemporal dementia. Yes. I understand dementia, the basic definition, caused by progressive brain damage that leads to a decline in memory, thinking, behavior, and the ability to perform daily activities. Yes. So that's normal dementia. You said his father, by the way, got dementia as well?
Yes, Alzheimer's. His father died from it. Yeah. Well, okay. Look, so talking about memory, for example, and a lot of people don't realize how badly his memory is deteriorating. When he met with Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer to negotiate over the government shutdown, he said, Chuck Schumer came and he brought a really nice man with him, brought a very nice man, as if he'd never met Hakeem Jeffries. Never mind remembering his name. Hey, I'm 67. I forget names all the time. I'm always terrified I'm going to do it on camera, and I do. But this is like he actually acted as if he'd never seen this person before. And Michael Wolff had reported on this in his biography, that Trump was running into old friends and not recognizing them as people he had ever met before. He has said multiple times and recently that his father was born in Germany. His grandfather was born in Germany. His father was born in the Bronx. Now, I've seen this kind of, they call it confusing the generations. My uncle had Alzheimer's, and he kept insisting that I was a lawyer because my father was a lawyer. But we're talking about someone who was in a nursing home.
How do we know whether he misspoke or whether he genuinely thought it was his father that was born in Germany?
Because he said it about half a dozen times. It wasn't one time. He's been saying it over and over again, and he's come back to saying it multiple times recently. Recently, he said that Kellyanne Conway was his press secretary, and he went on talking about how great Kelly is, and boy, she really isn't afraid to tell you people in the press to go shove it or whatever. And he just went on and on about Kellyanne Conway. he is showing huge deficits in memory. We just keep sane-washing him. The press keeps normalizing him. They keep kind of coming up with these, like you're doing, kind of trying to come up with some narrative that makes sense of something that, this is why 55% of the American people just look, they're not doctors, okay? But they're just normal people with good common sense who have had relatives, perhaps, who have had this disorder, who are saying he doesn't have the mental capacity to be president. 55%, not just Democrats. This is not a partisan issue. We've got to get past the whataboutism and partisan bickering, because we're really in a hell of a lot. I mean, I think it's more than danger. I think at this point, it will take a miracle to save us, because I believe that he will try to use nuclear weapons. If we have a chance, I actually wrote a book about this in 2018, or I edited a book about this. I had one paragraph I just wanted to read about him and nuclear weapons. But please, if you have time, if you have,
of course I do. I'm enjoying this. So please.
Okay.
Please.
All right. So the title of the book, and I'm not selling the book, believe me, it's way out of print. No one bought it. So it's called Rocket Man, Nuclear Madness in the Mind of Donald Trump. But here's how I summed up the nuclear risk then, because I think it's really more true now. Trump might push the button because at a moment of crisis, he lacks the cognitive capacity to objectively and critically analyze data, look at a standoff from an adversary's point of view, since he appears to have no empathy even when he was cognitively intact, or fashion creative alternatives to war. He might push the button because at times he appears to be in a true psychotic state, operating under the influence of grandiose and paranoid delusions, believing either that he is an invincible conqueror or that his adversary is imminently planning to attack when he is not. He might push the button because he is angry, impulsive, and determined to show the world who is boss by employing the ultimate power, as perverse as it sounds. Trump would revel in being the center of chaos and destruction. In a wag the dog scenario, he might push the button in a conscious, cynical calculation that while millions might die, war would distract from the Mueller investigation. This shows how dated it is. Now we call it the Epstein investigation, and rally his base behind him as commander-in-chief and consolidate his power. He might push the button because he is egged on to do so by his uber war hawk cabinet, who may throw gasoline on Trump's fire when they should be throwing buckets of cold water. Most likely, if doom awaits us, it will be some combination of these factors coming together in a perfect storm that will take us to DEFCON 1. I would add one more factor. In this administration, he has hired people who are pure yes men and women, okay? So that unlike the last administration, where he hired people who were qualified, who at some point had to say to him, no. If you read the New York Times article by Peter Baker a couple of weeks ago, John Kelly, his chief of staff in his first administration, actually went out he had someone go out in the middle of the night in secret and buy a copy of our book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. I'm a contributor. He read that book and he said that now he understood that his boss was mentally ill. This is quoted in the New York Times. And he finally understood how Trump thought. Now he finally understood what made Trump Trump. Okay, so he had people like that who were guardrails, right? Who argued that he didn't quit out of conscience the administration because someone needed to be there to contain him. Well, no one this time around. Trump was very careful to only select people. Well, I would say their first qualification is that they're not qualified. Seriously, none of these people really have a deep understanding of the departments they cover, or they have a contempt for it. And that way they can't say, well, sir, that's not how we do things here, or that's not what the research says, or that's not what the rules are. Okay. And also they're a little psychopathic, so they'll do whatever he wants. They're his cronies, they're his toadies. So that's what I'm worried about is they said that this general, denied him access to the nuclear codes. We don't know if that story is true. Right. It was just one person who said it on a podcast, some ex-CIA agent. But my fear is that sooner or later it's going to be true. And then that general will be fired because he doesn't want any firewalls. He doesn't want anyone who can say no matter how disordered or crazy the order is, no matter even if it's the ultimate destruction of humanity.
We have a case study that we could use, because we got to look at actions above words and what he's done. Obviously, he's made a lot of threats. He said he's done things that confuse people, like attacking the Pope, which he's then deleted. What we've seen now is a war that seemed like a mistake. Many reasons on why he got into it. There's strategic reasons. Controlling the Strait of Hormuz is very strategically important. People thought the regime would collapse after what happened in January. There's also the Israeli influence. Netanyahu and the Israeli intelligence offered them reports that the regime would collapse very quickly. Their military capabilities could be targeted. This is our one chance to bring down the Iranian regime. So there's all these different scenarios that were there that might have convinced him over the edge, thinking there's going to be a quick operation. But this is not the first first example at all that a president in the US or even in the world. The most recent one is Putin. Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. He thought Ukraine would fall within days. The war is ongoing now for whatever number of years, 3-4 years. And it's become a quagmire with 500,000 deaths on the Russian side and 1 million casualties on the Russian side alone, about the same number of deaths and casualties on the Ukrainian side. So, and that was a miscalculation as well. So if we look at Iran as a miscalculation, what would dictate his mental state, and this is obviously not an expert speaking, someone listening to you and just kind of going back and forth and challenging those points. If you look at his actions afterwards, when we got to the stage where he's making those threats, that was kind of D-Day in that regard. If you deliver on any of those threats, which there's still time to deliver to deliver on these threats, obviously. Well, the worries, which I'm sure you'll mention, the worries that Tucker Carlson had and others had, people more qualified than me, were validated. The other option, which is what I've been saying, is that he's going to off-ramp, and he just walked out of the war. He retweeted a Washington Post article saying, I'm happy to walk out even if there's no deal with Iran. Doesn't that go against narcissism and against the frontotemporal dementia concerns that you've illustrated in the book, his actions there? I'm not saying he doesn't have them, but do you say at least these actions might indicate that he might still be mentally well?
I think again, there is some, understandably, the nature of human nature, some wishful thinking here. If we look at the track record in terms of, as you say, behavior, not words, because that's where the rubber meets the road, he doesn't make idle threats. He does follow through on them. Look at the history. People keep discounting him, right, as some sort of bloviator, and then he does it. Look, I remember when I was comparing him to Hitler, I was really one of the first people in 2018. Someone said, "Oh, come on, you're just exaggerating. It's not like he's going to form concentration camps." I said, "Yes, he will." And he has. They're trying to basically, a concentration camp is not the same as a death camp. A concentration camp, like the Japanese internment camp, was a concentration camp. If you're concentrating a group of people based on their ethnicity or religion or whatever in some sort of place where they can't get out, that's a concentration camp. And he wants to build out Alligator Alcatraz. And actually, he was building out capacity for 250,000 immigrants in the desert in his first administration. But then with the child separation policy was one of the things that got so much uproar that he did back up, because he will temporarily back up when there's enough outroar. That is one thing he does, just like he did with this destroying civilization. But he always brings the truck back up again. Okay. Everyone went crazy, right? Crazy when he had the Muslim ban, right? Everyone went nuts. People went to the airports, right, just to protest, and he backed down. Well, now he's announced a ban of visiting or immigration from something like 25, 30 countries, and nobody's even noticed because we've desensitized to it. So the things that seem outrageous, where people finally do say, "Whoa, stop," he slows down. He doesn't really stop.
Well, you look at Venezuela, for example. He threatened to invade Venezuela, conduct a massive military operation. He did not discount the option of invading Venezuela, and ended up being a limited 1-hour operation to capture the president. You look at invading Greenland now, that goes in your category, that hasn't stopped yet. You go into Iran, he's threatened to wipe out a civilization. Obviously, he's walked away yet. So obviously, we don't know what will happen next, but everything's indicating the fact that he has completely walked away. Now, he might come back to a military strike, but it will be a more limited strike on their leadership. And even that's looking unlikely. And lastly, so that's on that point, on the delivering on the threats. There's some threats where he's delivered on, but there's many other threats. The taco as a term exists for a reason. There's so many threats he's made that he's kind of walked back on these threats. Go ahead, please.
But give him time. That's what I'm saying. Is if you look at the narrative over time, right? The things where people say, "That's it, absolutely no way," and there's a total uproar among everyone, even his own people. he backs off, but only temporarily. That's what I'm trying to say, is that I think that ultimately he is vindictive in a way where he never gives up. And this is one of the reasons that, he was so effective as a litigator. Really, he just never gives up. Attack. So I think that we are fooling ourselves. I think you're whistling in the graveyard to say, oh, well, he's just kind of, that's how he is. He's a big, beat his chest, but then he's taco and
some of it is wishful. Down. I think it's a bit of both. And I want to, before going back to the medical points, and I want to understand the concerns you have from a medical perspective. I want to respond to this. Some of it is wishful thinking. It's part of human nature. I'm hoping he's not a president that would destroy civilization. I'm hoping he would not go back and bomb Iran. I'm hoping he would not invade Greenland and throw away international law and order. The only shocking thing he's done so far that really bothered me is the Iran war, and so far he has walked away from it. Everything else is things I disagree with, but I'm mainly vehemently against wars. Things like what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Ukraine, those are the things I'm mainly against. Now, you made that comparison to Hitler. Obviously, you could be very critical of Trump. I think that's a very unfair comparison. Now, your argument is that we haven't really seen the worst of it. It's what you're worried about could happen, may be comparable to what Hitler has done. But it's also unfair to. I think it's just an unfair comparison. When those people make that word, or people throw away the word Holocaust or anti-Semitism, or comparing people to Nazis or Hitler, it kind of does a disservice to the atrocities of what happened in World War II. Like if you look at Trump, yes, but I'm not diminishing your right. You've studied this a lot longer than me. I'm giving you my perspective. You're the expert on it. But on the Hitler side, and disagree with me as well, but on the Hitler side, like the atrocities that Trump has committed, this war has had 1,000 deaths. That's 1,000 or 2,000. Every death is a tragedy. But if you compare that to what happened under other administrations, with Iraq, with Afghanistan, with Syria, with Libya, we're still in a very different. In Ukraine, that started obviously because of previous administrations. We're still in a very different position now to what we were under other presidents that were mentally there, Obama being included. So I just feel like, from the actions we've seen so far, there's a lot of questionable ones that I want to get your thoughts on. I want you to keep going through the list of different actions and things he said and what they indicate. But I also don't think we're at a stage where it is that concerning he could push the nuclear button. I know the guest you talked about, Larry Johnson, he's on the show on a regular basis. He told me about that report. He said it's unconfirmed. He was on my show yesterday, actually. He comes on regularly. Yeah, Larry Johnson. But so the report of him using a nuclear weapon, he was asked about it yesterday. He explicitly said, I'm never going to use a nuclear weapon. Obviously, words are worthless. It's actions what counts. But I also think, even though I agree with you, he's surrounded by yes men, I also think they have a limit. I think General Kane, for example, he didn't oppose Trump based on the, I think, New York Times article. He should have done more to oppose the war in Iran based on the reports we've heard. But I think he would not be in. Larry Johnson said the same thing. He doesn't think General Kane would ever use the nuclear weapons. You said Trump will just get rid of him. But my question to you is, I want you to respond to all my points, Doctor. And then I've got a question on top of it. So I'll give you the mic for a while because I've said a lot. My next question is, I want to continue going through because you started talking about the frontotemporal dementia. You started with memory, and you mentioned earlier the loss of decorum. So I'd love to go through the various symptoms as well and the indications that you're seeing. Sorry for mentioning so many points.
Not at all. So first of all, I totally respect what you're saying about the Holocaust. And, I'm Jewish. So some of my relatives get mad when I, say they don't want me to trivialize the Holocaust. There's people in my family who voted for Trump. But the thing is that the reason I'm making that statement, and the reason why I've been one of the best predictors of Trump's behavior of anyone on the scene, and I'm saying that not because I'm a prophet or because I'm a genius, but because of my professional training. The term malignant narcissism is actually a very historically obscure diagnosis. It's not in the DSM. The DSM. It was introduced by Erich Fromm, the famous psychoanalyst who escaped Hitler, to explain the psychology of Hitler, not just individually, but as a type. That he saw Hitler, he saw Stalin, he saw these, grandiose, violent, strong men, right, ruling the world. And he said, what is this type of personality? So when I say he's I'm not saying he's as bad as Hitler, but what I'm saying is he's cut from the same cloth personality.
Can you describe what
Yes.
malignant? I wrote a note as well. What does it mean?
So malignant narcissism, I actually studied under somebody named Otto Kernberg, who's actually the living expert on malignant narcissism. I say he's a living expert because most people don't study it. It's like I said, something historical, but he's a very famous analyst. And he's broken it down to 4 components. Narcissism, of course, his grandiosity, his entitlement, paranoia, right? The feeling that he's always aggrieved, he's always a victim, that the people he doesn't like are actually enemies, that they're evil, that certain immigrants or certain ethnic groups or people who don't agree with him are all evil and attacking him. Antisocial personality disorder, what we used to call psychopathy. This is the criminal personality. These are people who lie. Well, he's the most documented liar in human history, according to the Washington Post, right? Who lie, who break laws, who break norms, who violate the rights of others, who feel no remorse or conscience about it. And finally, sadism. So that he enjoys the destruction and the chaos. And, there was that Tuesday night when if they didn't surrender by, 9 p.m., he was going to destroy their civilization. And basically 1 billion people were quaking in their boots. So after 9 o'clock, is this the end of the world? He gets off on that. He gets pleasure from scaring and degrading and destroying other people. It's hard for us who aren't that sick to understand that, but it's all throughout his behavior. This is not something you need to have a mental health degree to know. You just look at his life. This is the kind of person that he is. Okay. Now add the frontotemporal dementia, and let me get to your question about some of the other signs. So we talked about memory. Let's talk about language. Actually, studies have been done in his level of vocabulary. So first of all, as you pointed out, with dementia, we have to be able to diagnose a deterioration from someone's own baseline, right? That's very important. So it's not where they are, it's where they've come from and how far they've fallen that we use to diagnose the disorder. So what a lot of people don't realize is that Trump actually used to be quite articulate. He was always somewhat what I would call a jerk. The Chinese are ripping us off. But he used to speak in polished paragraphs. Now he has trouble completing a sentence, a thought, and sometimes even a word. One of the formal signs of dementia is something we call phonemic paraphasias. It's where people can't complete a word. They can use a fragment of the word, but they can't say the whole word, acetaminophen, there's all these things online, right? These kind of ha-ha comedian things of all his, mispronunciations. But this is why it's not good to gag doctors, because that is actually a formal medical sign that we only see in serious organic brain disorders. We don't see it when people are drunk or old or tired. It's really specific to dementia. But the other thing is his thought process has been so tangential, right? I mean, one of the things I used to do on some of the shows is I would actually read 5 minutes, of his speech verbatim. And when we see it on the news, right, they have a clip of something he said, and then they talk about it and normalize it. They don't play you the whole rambling, confused, tangential, where he's going from one thing to another. But, for example, during the campaign, this is like the classic example. He's talking about, these immigrants, they're all coming from insane asylums. Well, he's talking about insane asylums. Well, that makes him think about a movie he saw about an insane asylum. Hey, anyone here seen Silence of the Lambs? He goes, the late, great Hannibal Lecter. Yeah, they don't like to talk about him anymore. But now, first of all, he can't be late and great because he's fictional. And now he's describing him as if he's actually a living person who died, And also, now we're talking about Silence of the Lambs, and now he's talking about how we don't like to talk about Hannibal Lecter anymore, but he's actually a great guy. Well, actually, that's kind of interesting psychologically, since he's a serial killer. I would argue at this point, Trump is a serial killer, and as well as a serial rapist. So maybe that's why he would admire someone like Hannibal Lecter. I'm just giving that as an example. There's tons of examples, and actually, if you have time, I can read you some of his verbatim things, but so there's that. And finally, there's confabulation, that when people are losing their memory, they start to remember things that didn't happen. So it's not lying. And this is where I would say, his psychopathy is great camouflage for his dementia, because he's been telling these crazy stories about, he's always been a liar. But this isn't the kind of story you tell to impress people. You know what I mean? It's not like it saying that the prices of eggs are down when they're really up, or he handled COVID great. This is where he went on a whole story about how, his uncle had the Unabomber in his class. And he said, yeah, Uncle John, what was he like? Well, he was really smart, but he was a smart aleck. People didn't like him. And it's this long story. Well, the Unabomber was not in his uncle's class. The Unabomber didn't go to his school, and no one knew who the Unabomber was till his uncle was dead. He made this up, just like he made up I don't know if you heard that speech where they were talking about the Iran war, and he goes on a 5-minute, totally, they timed it, 5-minute tangential talking about the Sharpie pen, and talk about, the Sharpie pen, I've been signing in gold pens, these $1,000 gold pens, and we've been giving them away. These kids are taking them. They don't even know what they've got. It's like, Mom, what is this? It's like, I feel bad for the government. We're giving away all these pens. But then I also said to the Sharpie people, I can't sign, Biden never signed, but I can't sign with your pen. It would look wrong. And they said, well, sir, what can we do? Well, we can make the pen in gold, and we can put your name on it. And none of this ever happened. There was never a gold Sharpie pen. There was never $1,000 Sharpie pen. The people from Sharpie denied they ever spoke to him about making a special pen. In other words, he breaks off from a meeting about the Iran war to talk about a pen and to tell a story that never, ever happened. And in a very confused and sort of tangential way, where even you're having trouble following him, talking about the pen. And the mother said, well, what is this, Mom? What is this? They didn't even know what they had. And, so I am actually very jealous for the government. I want to save money for the government. So I went and I talked to the Sharpie people. I said, again, if this were your father, you would be rushing to the neurologist. You really would.
Yeah, the last point. So I want to address something you've said you're going to get out of the way, because you've mentioned a lot of interesting points, and ones like the Sharpie pen one's a bit concerning if you're saying the president's fabricating stories, that's concerning. I don't know the story. But then you did sneak in the middle of the discussion when you mentioned him as a serial rapist. We know there's that one. Do you genuinely believe he's a serial rapist?
I'm actually, look, we have one case that has been adjudicated, right? But we've got like 35 women who have accused him. It's funny, when people don't commit sexual assault, they don't tend to have dozens of accusers. And we have him confessing on the Access Hollywood tape. Come on, this guy is a sexual predator. There's every sign of it. And also, we know he's guilty of sin in those Epstein files, even from what we've already seen.
But I'm very critical of the Epstein files. I'm one of the loudest voices covering it. The argument on the Epstein files, which I know, if I had to guess, he's covering for some people. Most people guess, including people on the Democrats. I've had Ro Khanna, Marjorie Taylor Greene. They believe that he's covering for his donors or people that he knows. Rand Paul's been on the show as well. If there's something on him on theEpstein files, you'd expect Biden to release it. That will be the counter argument to that.
No, not if you know how weak Biden was. That's the whole point. Biden was so weak. He never did it. He didn't prosecute him. He didn't fire any of the corrupt people that he appointed.
But under Biden, though, but I'm not too deep in domestic politics in the US, but under Biden, we know there was lawfare. Under the Trump, they were trying to do everything to bring him down, any case that they could use against Trump. They've had the case.
I have to disagree with you about that. I think it's the opposite. I think because he was weak and he had a weak attorney general, it delayed the Smith investigation. But had they've been able to continue, they had him hands down convicted of trying to overthrow the election. Not to mention stealing the secret documents. And by the way, I was one of the people that predicted 3 years before January 6th that he would not surrender power willingly, that he would fight to stay in power, physically fight to stay in power. And everyone said, oh, that's crazy. Well, how did I know to predict that? Because he's a malignant narcissist. That's what they do. And the problem with malignant narcissists, the other thing that they do is they prosecute war until they consume their countries and themselves. And that's why I think what you're talking about now is wishful thinking, and it's psychologically naive.
Doctor, obviously you're very critical of Trump. Before we go back to the frontotemporal dementia and the malignant narcissism, because I've wrote notes about all the symptoms and I've got questions on them. You're very critical of Trump. You've criticized him on the Epstein files. You've criticized him in both his administrations, various policies, the lawfare against him, the cases against him. So my question to you is, do you worry because you're diagnosing the president without meeting him, which obviously anyone has the right to do. It's hard to know things for a fact, but you've been studying him for a long time. Do you worry that your critique of Trump and how much you oppose a lot of his policies or the way he handles things, and rightly so, I disagree with the way he's handled Epstein files being on top of my list. Do you worry that this is impacting as well the diagnosis of the way you look at certain things he says? For example, when he says he rambles on in a speech, how do you know whether it's frontotemporal dementia or whether it's just old age? Because you do see that a lot with the elderly.
Yep. Well, actually, we had a psychologist do a study of this, actually. And by the way, I really have to say, I don't know what Biden has or had. I actually don't have a hypothesis. I don't know what we missed, if we missed something. I just really feel like, especially as a member of the public and not a member of the press, I spent very little time with him. And I think they kind of kept him out of view to a great extent. But I think what I worry about is that people will dismiss what we're saying, right? Because they'll just see it as partisan, and they won't instead actually consider the facts that are right before their eyes. They won't consider that we might be, that what we're saying makes sense because it fits the data. And that the reason for talking about it wasn't because we wanted to influence an election. I'm not a politician. I'm writing a book about psilocybin therapy, okay? Everything that's happened with Trump has been an interruption of my career. I know people are like, well, isn't that great? You get to be on Mario's show. It's like, yeah, but that's not really that wasn't my goal, okay? The thing is that we felt we had a duty to warn the public.
Why didn't you?
Because we saw such alarming psychiatric disorder and such dangerous, not just disordered, but dangerous behavior that we felt we needed to warn the public. And so it's important that we actually look at the fact that we're at risk right now, regardless of who you voted for or which side you're on, right? If this goes the wrong way, we're all going to die together.
So 2 points, actually 2 questions. The first one on Biden, why were you not as critical on Biden's mental state? Do you agree that he also seemed very cognitively not there? I've had people spoke to him behind the scenes. I will speak to them. They're like, Mario, we have concerns. He's not there. And they started speaking more and more publicly once Trump became in office.
Well, I will say that I think that they really did try to hide him to a certain extent. And so what we would see would be very like he would be wandering, at the D-Day ceremony. That was like kind of, things like that, or he would speak sort of in a raspy way or kind of slow way. But those aren't formal signs of dementia. Those are more associated with aging. What I was going to say is a colleague of mine did a study where he analyzed speeches of Trump's and Biden's when they were young, and then compared them to speeches when they were older. And he looked for a series of variables. Some of them were signs of aging, like speaking very softly or slowly, moving very slowly. Others were signs of dementia, like phonemic paraphasias that I was talking about, tangential thinking. And what he saw was that Biden had started to show many signs of aging, not any signs of dementia. Now, I don't know. He might have it, he might not have it, but we haven't seen the evidence. That's what I'm saying, that we've seen in the case of Trump. We've seen him look confused. We've seen him, look blank. And also I haven't seen him that as closely as I've seen Trump, because he was more hidden and Trump is more out there. But the thing is that what we're seeing in Trump, and this is what he showed in the study, is he was showing formal signs of thought disorder that we associate with dementia. And Biden wasn't. Biden was showing decline, but not dementia-related decline. And I think that's roughly what's going on. But in any case, it doesn't matter because we're where we are now. And right now, we're all at risk.
I have a question for you. If we use, so the only way to know for sure, maybe, obviously I've mentioned that your critique of Trump and your personal opinion of him and his way of handling things and him as a president and his policies, I asked you the question on whether that impacts your diagnosis. So whether that does or not, the only thing that proves maybe you're absolutely right, maybe it does impact your diagnosis and your diagnosis is still right, the only way to know is when you see his actions over the next 2 to 3 years. And that's where your biggest concern is. And we kind of hinted in the beginning of the interview, that's what will dictate on whether, you made the comparison to Hitler. I said this mainly applies on what he does next, because he hasn't done anything that
So if
compares.
he kills 100 million people, then you'll have me on your show and say, guess what, Dr. Gartner, you were right. And guess what? I'm not
hopefully we don't get there.
Being right.
Hopefully we don't get there. My question, though, is on something immediate right now that is unfolding in front of us. And that is the perfect example of where, so if what you're saying is right, what would you expect to happen next in the war in Iran? Because the war in Iran fits a lot of the criteria. If you do believe he's a sadist, you do believe in his, the antisocial behavior, breaking laws, putting lying aside. I think most politicians lie. Trump lies all the time, and I call him out for it. The paranoia, a lot of people says he's paranoid about Iran, the Iranian regime trying to kill him. Narcissism is kind of a bit more aside. If you put all these things together and your diagnosis is accurate, what would you expect to happen next in the war in Iran?
Well, here's the thing. I always say about people need to understand about dementia is you don't get better, you don't stay the same, you just get worse. So I've been saying for 2 years, look at Donald Trump today. That's the best Donald Trump you're ever going to see, because he's a rock rolling downhill. The other thing, though, is that at a certain point, the deterioration accelerates. And we are now in that phase. So, for example, a lot of people, when he became president for the second time, who worked for him in his administration, said he's not the man he was 4 years ago. There were multiple people who said that. Now, he's almost not the man he was 4 weeks ago. We're really seeing a rapid deterioration in real time. So I really feel like we are over the brink, because it's his nature, and it's the nature of his personality disorder and the nature of frontotemporal dementia for him to act out impulsively, aggressively, inappropriately, ill-advisedly. Okay. And he's not listening to anybody else. No one can control him. No one can advise him. He's even said he'll make the decision to go to war or not when he feels it in his bones. Okay. We're in so much trouble. Okay. We're spinning out of control.
So my question then to you, when he says things like feel it in the bones, I'm going to wipe out a civilization. For me, the actions is what counts. If he says, I'm going to destroy the country, I'm going to wipe out their civilization, and then walks away, for the walking away is a lot more important than all the words he said before walking away. And if he says nothing and then suddenly starts bombing their bridges and hospitals and schools and infrastructure and energy infrastructure and destroys the country, kills 10,000 people, that's, Putin speaks very eloquently. He doesn't make statements like Trump does. But then if you look at the destruction in Ukraine and how long that war has gone on, 1 million deaths there, 1,000 to 2,000 in Iran, again, not diminishing any casualty. So can I bring that back to my question, Doctor, is if what you're saying is correct, what would you expect to see in his actions moving forward?
Yeah. More inexplicable threats, destruction, actions, right? He is addicted to military conquest. Okay. He said the military can't wait for their next conquest. He said, I'll take Cuba next. In other words, I don't know who he's going to bomb, when he's going to bomb them, or what it is that's going to provoke those neurons to go off in his head. But he's going to be bombing. He's going to continue to be a military aggressor and to be a would-be conqueror. And eventually the world balance is not going to be able to sustain it.
And a final question, Doctor, is what would make you question your diagnosis? If Trump does X, Y, Z, obviously it's not one certain action, kind of a list of actions or behavior, that would make you question that maybe this was because of old age, maybe this is the madman theory, maybe this is X, Y, Z diagnosis, something else other than malignant narcissism or frontotemporal dementia. What are these indicators that are more positive indicators in your view?
Well, if he had actually not gone to war with Iran and announced that they're giving up their uranium, they're degrading their uranium, they're not making any more uranium, I did it. If he had done that, I would have had to eat crow. I said that on the air. I said, if he does that, I'm going to have to admit that I'm wrong. But he didn't. What
were you saying? Actually, I wish we spoke. What were you saying when he was making those threats about wiping out a civilization? Were you worried he's going to? I'm assuming you were worried he's actually going to deliver on these threats.
I think that we should all be very, very worried that he's going to deliver on these.
If he does not, and he actually permanently walks away from Iran, and we see a deal in a few weeks' time, or even walks away with no deal, which is very difficult for a president, someone who's narcissistic like President Trump. He's walking away from Iran, a war with Iran, with a strategically an immense loss for the US. Iran still has their nuclear enriched uranium. They have their ballistic missile program, their proxies, and they control the Strait of Hormuz. So the outcome of the war, the objectives are not achieved, and the worst case scenario kind of unfolded for the US and US interests. If he walks away, if he does walk away from all this and moves on to the next thing, that would contradict him being a narcissist, because that's him accepting a loss and just letting it be a loss. Obviously, from a political perspective, trying to turn it into a win.
Well, and that's one of the reasons he's so dangerous, is he's not going to accept losing. All he cares about is how things make him feel about himself in the moment. And so he's not thinking about consequences. He's not thinking about morality. He's not thinking about war crimes or genocide or anything else. Remember, he was saying, "Oh, I use my own morality when deciding to go to war, you know, and my own judgment, you know." So this is not going to, well, this is my prediction. This is not going to end well.
Doctor, it's a pleasure to meet you. I really appreciate you coming on the show. I really enjoyed the conversation. And, you know, fingers crossed, next time I'll have you on the show, I'll be telling you like, "Hey, doctor, I think you got it wrong." Instead of you telling me, "Mario, I told you, Mario, I told you so." Because if the latter will be very problematic.
Happy to eat my hat on your show live.
But doctor, absolute pleasure to meet you. Thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, John. All right, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Obviously it's a move away from the war in Iran. And I came into this conversation, I told my team, because they booked it for me, I said, "Look, I don't know who Dr. Gartner is. My team has been telling me about the concerns about Trump's mental well-being for a while, even before this war. And I've avoided doing interviews on it. And we just did this one. And I came in with a completely open mind. I enjoyed the conversation. As the conversation went on, and I said this to Dr. Gartner directly, I said, I'm worried that his opinion of Trump, putting politics aside, just opinion of him as a person, also of his policies, so politics as well, is influencing his diagnosis. Now, number one, you can't diagnose someone without meeting them. It's important to put that disclaimer. I'm sure Dr. Gartner would agree, but it does not mean you cannot give your opinion and try to diagnose based on the publicly available information. But I worry, and I've said this to the doctor, that his opinion of Trump as a person is impacting that diagnosis. And I've given my thoughts on it as well. So my position is the same. I'm very critical of the war, about Trump's mental well-being. Obviously not as worried as the doctor. He's 79 years old, so it's something that should be discussed. But I was one of the few, and I got a lot of critique for it, that was not concerned when Trump was making these threats to Iran. I don't like the president to speak that way. There's a certain way of speaking when you're a president, because obviously, especially when you're the president of the world's biggest superpower, you set the example to the rest of the world on how to speak, how to behave. So I don't like the way Trump speaks, but I accept it. That's how he speaks, and there's a positive side to it, because he speaks his mind. He tells you things directly as they are. But I said back then, I said the war's coming to an end. So that was my assumption. And you guys probably know this by now, as he was making those threats. And I was not worried about him nuking Iran. And actions are what counts. And the actions that followed is him walking away and accepting this as defeat. So for me, that gave me a lot of peace of mind, because I started getting worried after this war. Not worried like Dr. Gartner, but worried in general of behind the scenes what was happening to lead to this very, very unnecessary war. But look, I really hope you enjoyed the conversation. Let me know in the comments. We'll probably do this again, and for the next one, I'll probably get two guests, maybe Dr. Gartner and someone else, to make it into a debate. Two guests that understand these topics a lot better. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much for your time. That's it for today. And I'll see you tomorrow, as always. We're going to start doing more interviews away from the Iran war. Let me know what topics you'd like us to cover. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.